Welcome. I am Melesias. Today, we are not opening a novel, a confession, or a satirical masterpiece. We are opening a book that changed what it means to be human. It is a book that answered the single most profound question we can ask: where do we come from? And it answered it not with a myth, or a prayer, or a philosophical argument, but with evidence. With careful, patient, mountains of evidence gathered over a lifetime of observation. We are opening on The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. But before we can understand the idea, we must first understand the man. And this is where we must immediately set aside the familiar image. The Charles Darwin we know, the old, bearded patriarch, the Victorian sage with a wise, weary face, is not the man who began this journey. The book was born from the curiosity of a young man, a quiet, slightly awkward, and deeply observant soul who, almost by accident, found himself on a ship that would change the world. He was not a brilliant student. His father, a successful doctor, considered him a disappointment, telling him once, with a mixture of exasperation and love, "You care for nothing but shooting, dogs, and rat-catching, and you will be a disgrace to yourself and all your family." Young Charles was adrift. He had tried medicine in Edinburgh and hated it. He was now studying at Cambridge, not for any grand purpose, but because it was the expected path to becoming a country parson, a quiet, respectable life surrounded by nature. His true passion was not the classroom. It was collecting beetles, with a fervor that bordered on obsession. He was a man who could look at a single, tiny insect and see a universe. And then, a letter arrived. It was an invitation that almost never came. An opportunity to join a naval survey ship, the HMS Beagle, as a gentleman companion to the captain and, unofficially, as its naturalist. The ship's mission was to map the coasts of South America. It was a chance to see the world, to collect specimens from places no Englishman had ever catalogued before. But his father was against it. It was a dangerous, useless detour from a respectable life. It was only through the intervention of his uncle, Josiah Wedgwood, who argued the case persuasively to his father, that the young man was allowed to go. And so, almost by accident, a disappointed medical student and a future parson who loved beetles more than theology, boarded a ship that would carry him not just across an ocean, but into the heart of the greatest scientific revolution in history. The Beagle was not a grand vessel. It was a small, cramped, 10-gun brig, barely 90 feet long. Life on board was noisy, smelly, and often terrifying. Young Darwin was almost constantly seasick, miserable, and homesick. But when the ship anchored, a different man emerged. He would rush ashore, often spending weeks on land while the ship continued its surveying work. He was not just a passive observer. He was a man possessed by a quiet, relentless energy. He rode with gauchos across the Argentine pampas, tasting a life of wild freedom. He hiked through dense, humid Brazilian jungles, overwhelmed by the sheer, riotous chaos of delight in the biodiversity around him. He dug fossils from cliffs, uncovering the bones of giant, extinct creatures that seemed like monstrous versions of the animals still living there. He held a giant ground sloth's skull in his hands and wondered. He studied a tiny, mole-like creature called a tuco-tuco, and listened to the stories of the gauchos who said they were born blind. He was filling his notebooks, his jars, and his mind with a puzzle that was growing larger and more complex with every passing mile. Everything he saw, everything he collected, was slowly, silently, chipping away at the comfortable, accepted view of the world. The belief was that species were fixed, created individually by God, perfect and unchanging. But the fossils whispered a different story. Why would God create giant sloths, allow them to go extinct, and then replace them with smaller, similar versions? The geography asked its own questions. Why did similar climates on different continents have such radically different animals? The young man did not have an answer. He was not a theorist. He was, first and foremost, an observer. And he was observing a world that did not fit the neat, static picture he had been taught. The journey that had begun as a young man's adventure was transforming, slowly, imperceptibly, into a scientific quest that would alter the destiny of human thought. The journey continued. The Beagle sailed further south, mapping the jagged, desolate coast of Tierra del Fuego at the very tip of the continent. Here, Darwin encountered a landscape of stark, almost terrifying beauty, mountains plunging into icy, stormy seas, glaciers calving into the water. And he encountered a people who seemed to exist at the very edge of humanity itself, the indigenous Fuegians. Watching them, living in such a raw, untamed state, yet sharing the same fundamental human nature, raised profound questions about civilization, adaptation, and the vast spectrum of human existence. The world, he was learning, was far stranger, more complex, and more interconnected than any book in his father's library had ever suggested. Then, the Beagle turned north, sailing up the western coast of the continent. Here, Darwin witnessed the raw, terrifying power of the earth itself. In Chile, he experienced a massive earthquake that shattered the city of Concepcion, killing hundreds and lifting the coastline by several feet in a matter of seconds. He saw the ruins of a cathedral, the ground he stood on having been violently, irrevocably altered. He found seashells embedded in rocks high in the Andes Mountains, undeniable proof that the land had been pushed up from the ocean floor over immense periods of time. This was not a stable, recently created world. It was a dynamic, ancient, and often violent planet, constantly reshaping itself. And if the earth itself was not fixed, he began to wonder, could its inhabitants be fixed either? And then, finally, in the autumn of 1835, the Beagle sailed west into the open Pacific, towards a cluster of isolated, volcanic islands straddling the equator, the Galapagos archipelago. These islands were not a tropical paradise. They were harsh, black, sun-scorched rocks, covered in strange, thorny scrub. The land was alien, almost reptilian. It was a world seemingly untouched by man. The creatures there were unique, giant tortoises so large a man could ride on their backs, strange black lizards that swam in the sea and fed on algae, and birds so tame they would land on your hat. Darwin, still not a revolutionary, was busy collecting specimens, especially of the island's birds, the famous finches. He was meticulously preserving them, labeling them, but, in his rush, he made a critical error. He failed to note which island each finch came from. The full significance of what he was seeing would not strike him until much later. The Beagle sailed on, across the vast Pacific and Indian Oceans, stopping at coral atolls and distant colonies. The young man had time, now, on the long, monotonous stretches at sea, to think. He began to organize his notes, to catalog his staggering collection. He was particularly puzzled by what he had seen on the Galapagos. The local governor had casually mentioned that you could tell which island a giant tortoise came from just by the shape of its shell. The islands were identical in climate and geology, barely 50 miles apart, yet each seemed to possess its own unique variety of life. The mockingbirds he had collected also showed variations between islands. Slowly, a thought began to form, a thought so radical, so unsettling, that it felt like a confession. Could it be that species were not fixed at all? Could a single, original species, blown by the wind to a new island, somehow, over vast ages, be modified and become something new? The idea was terrifying in its implications. The Beagle finally returned to England in October 1836. The young man who stepped off the ship was not the same one who had left. He was older, more weathered, and his mind was a universe away. He was already being hailed as a brilliant naturalist, his collections and letters having made him a celebrity in scientific circles. But the quiet, seasick young man carried a secret. He had not found a proof for the divine design of nature. He had found a puzzle that seemed to lead to a different, more profound, and far more dangerous conclusion. He would not publish it for over 20 years. The idea was too big, too frightening, too certain to provoke a storm. The work of a lifetime, the quiet labor of a meticulous mind, had just begun. The young adventurer who had returned from his global odyssey was gone. In his place, settled into a quiet, comfortable life in a country house called Down House in the village of Down, was a man battling a mysterious, chronic illness. No one is quite sure what Darwin suffered from, but its symptoms were debilitating: violent shivering, vomiting, exhaustion, and heart palpitations. It would plague him for the rest of his life. He became a semi-recluse, a man who lived by a strict, quiet routine. He rarely traveled. He rarely even left his home and its gardens. But within this gentle, domestic prison, his mind was free. It was here, in his study, surrounded by books, letters, and a growing mountain of specimens, that the quiet, meticulous work began. He was not ready to tell the world his dangerous idea. First, he had to prove it to himself. He did not start with the exotic finches of the Galapagos. He started much closer to home. He started with something every Englishman understood: breeding. He began to study, with an obsessive passion, the world of domestic animals. He kept every breed of pigeon he could find: pouters, carriers, fantails, tumblers. He bred them, dissected them, and meticulously measured their skeletons. He joined London pigeon fancying clubs, talking to the breeders, these humble, unlettered men who were, in his eyes, the greatest experimentalists of all. He studied dogs, cattle, horses, and garden plants. He wanted to understand one simple thing: how did a wolf become a greyhound? How did a wild, bitter cabbage become a cauliflower, a kale, a Brussels sprout? The answer, the breeders told him, was simple. They chose. They looked at their animals and plants, and they selected the individuals with the traits they desired, and they bred from them. Generation after generation, they shaped life to their will. This was the crucial first step. Darwin called this process artificial selection. Humans, he realized, were acting as a powerful, creative force. They could not create a new trait out of nothing, but they could take the tiny, random variations that appear in every living thing: a slightly longer neck, a slightly thicker coat of fur, and, by consistently choosing to breed from that one individual, they could accumulate those tiny changes over decades and centuries until a new form, a new breed, emerged. The power was in the accumulation. No single step was large. A wolf did not suddenly give birth to a greyhound. But over hundreds of generations of human choice, the wolf was, undeniably, transformed. The static, fixed, kind, of the Bible was a fiction. Life was plastic, moldable. It could change. And it could change dramatically. This, Darwin argued, was the observable, undeniable fact. But this was not yet his theory. This was just the foundation. The next, and far more audacious step, was to ask the terrifying question: if humans can so powerfully shape life through selection in just a few centuries, what could nature itself do, acting not on a whim, but through a constant, unyielding pressure over millions of years? The quiet, patient man in his country's study was gathering the threads of an argument that would lead him directly to the war in nature, a silent, invisible, and endless battle for survival. And that battle, he realized, was the engine of the entire living world. From the peaceful, controlled world of the pigeon coop and the garden, Darwin now turned to face the harsh, unblinking reality of wild nature. He had seen it everywhere on his voyage: the jungle, the Patagonian desert, the crowded tide pools of the Pacific. And what he had seen was not a world of peace and plenty, but a world of constant, relentless struggle. Every single creature, from the mightiest elephant to the smallest insect, is engaged in a daily battle for its life. The philosopher Thomas Malthus had written about this grim arithmetic for human populations: they grow exponentially, but their food supply does not, leading to famine, disease, and death. Darwin, with a flash of insight, applied this logic to the entire natural world. The numbers, he realized, were terrifying. A single pair of robins, breeding unchecked, could theoretically produce millions of descendants in just a few decades. A single salmon produces tens of thousands of eggs. An orchid produces hundreds of thousands of dust-like seeds. Yet, the world is not overrun by robins, salmon, or orchids. Most of this abundance of life never survives. This, Darwin argued, is the universal law of existence. Every organism produces more offspring than can possibly survive. The result is what he called, in a chillingly understated phrase, the struggle for existence. This is not always a bloody, tooth-and-claw battle. A plant on the edge of a desert is struggling not against a predator, but against drought. Two seedlings of the same tree are struggling against each other for the same patch of sunlight. The struggle is often silent, invisible, and extraordinarily patient. But it is always there. It is the fundamental condition of being alive. The world is not a finished creation. It is a crowded, competitive arena, and every single player in that arena, without exception, is fighting for its place. And it was from this grim, unavoidable logic that Darwin made his great, intuitive leap. If there is a struggle, he reasoned, then any tiny, accidental variation that gives a creature even the slightest edge in that struggle, a slightly faster leg, a slightly tougher beak, a slightly better camouflage, would be more likely to ensure its survival. That creature would have a slightly better chance of living long enough to reproduce. And its offspring would inherit that winning trait. The ones without the advantage would, over time, be eliminated. Nature, in this way, is not a conscious designer. It is a blind, unthinking, and utterly relentless filter. It is doing the same thing the pigeon breeder does, but on a scale of time and power that is almost impossible for the human mind to comprehend. The breeder selects for a fancy tale. Nature selects for survival. The engine of life was not divine whim. It was this. Darwin called it natural selection. The long argument was finally complete. A theory as grand and as terrifying as natural selection does not go unchallenged. And what makes On the Origin of Species such a unique and powerful work is that Darwin did not wait for his critics to attack. He attacked himself. He dedicated entire chapters not to proving his theory, but to listing its difficulties, to confronting the puzzles that seemed to contradict his beautiful, logical edifice. This was not false modesty. It was the mark of a truly scientific mind, a man more devoted to the truth than to his own ego. He looked at his theory and asked the hardest questions he could think of. And then, piece by piece, he began to provide the answers. The first, and perhaps the most obvious, objection was this: if new species arise by the slow, gradual accumulation of tiny changes, where is the evidence? Where are all the intermediate forms, the countless transitional fossils that should document every single step of this long, slow dance? Why is the geological record not a seamless, unbroken chain of life forms, each one melting into the next? The answer, Darwin argued, lies not in a flaw in the theory, but in a profound flaw in the evidence itself. The geological record, he explained, is not a complete history of the world. It is a book from which most of the pages have been torn out, and those that remain are tattered, scrambled, and written in a fading ink. Fossilization is an incredibly rare event. It requires very specific conditions that almost never occur. The vast majority of creatures that have ever lived have simply vanished without a trace, consumed by the world they lived in. Another profound challenge came from the world of instincts. How, the critics asked, can a blind, unthinking process like natural selection produce something as exquisitely complex and purposeful as the instinct of a honeybee, which builds perfect hexagonal cells with a mathematical precision that seems to require an engineering degree? Or the slave-making instinct of certain ants, which raid the nests of other species, steal their pupae, and raise them as a captive workforce? This looks, at first glance, like intelligent design. But Darwin, with his characteristic patience, began to dismantle this argument. He found a spectrum of intermediate instincts. He studied humblebees whose nests were clumsy, irregular structures, a halfway house on the road to the perfect hexagon. He studied species of ants that were only occasionally parasitic, a stepping stone to the full-blown slave makers. Every complex instinct, he argued, could be broken down into a series of small, beneficial, and cumulative steps. The perfection we see is not the starting point. It is the end result of millions of years of relentless, tiny improvements. Perhaps the most fascinating objection, however, was not about missing fossils or complex instincts. It was about the very definition of a species. The standard test at the time was fertility. If two animals could breed and produce fertile offspring, they were of the same species. If they could not, if their offspring were sterile mules, then they were different species. Sterility, it was argued, must be a divinely implanted barrier to keep the created kind separate. Darwin, however, turned this argument on its head. He showed that sterility is not a fixed, divine law. It exists on a gradient. Some closely related species produce perfectly fertile hybrids. Other, more distant crosses produce sterile offspring. It is a messy, continuous spectrum, not a clear line. And he argued that sterility was not a specially endowed gift, but a side effect of divergence. As two populations evolve apart, their reproductive systems simply become incompatible, like two complex machines whose parts no longer fit together. The barrier between species was not created by God. It was created by evolution itself. From all these diverse arguments, from the fossils to the instincts to the hybrid flowers, Darwin was constructing a single, magnificent, and deeply unsettling picture. He was replacing the static, ordered, hierarchical ladder of creation with a single, sprawling, branching tree. Life was not a staircase rising to perfection, with man at the top. It was a single, ancient, tangled tree, branching out in all directions, with every twig and leaf connected by an unbroken chain of descent to a single, common root. And we, the human species, were not standing on the top of this tree. We were just one small, recent, outlying twig on a vast, ancient, and ever-growing bush. This was the final, humbling conclusion of the long argument. And it was this vision, more than any other, that would provoke the fury of the world. The theory was complete. The evidence was overwhelming. And for 20 years, Charles Darwin told almost no one. He had returned from his voyage in 1836. By 1838, the core idea of natural selection was already clear in his notebooks. Yet, On the Origin of Species was not published until 1859. Why? Why did a man who had solved the greatest mystery of the natural world keep it a secret for 2 decades? The answer is not simple. He was genuinely ill, suffering from a mysterious malady that left him exhausted and bedridden for days. But there was also a deeper, more human reason. He was afraid. He knew the firestorm his theory would ignite. He knew it would shatter the comfortable Victorian world, challenge the authority of the Church, and fundamentally alter humanity's understanding of its own place in creation. He was not a confrontational man. He was a gentle, peace-loving invalid who just wanted to study barnacles and tend his garden. And so, for 20 years, he worked in secret, accumulating more and more evidence, building an unassailable fortress of facts, waiting, perhaps, for a courage that would never come. The catalyst finally came in 1858, in the form of a letter from a young, unknown naturalist working in the Malay archipelago. His name was Alfred Russel Wallace. He had contracted a tropical fever, and in a delirious flash of insight, had arrived at exactly the same theory of natural selection. He sent a short paper to Darwin, the one man he admired most, asking for his opinion. Darwin was devastated. His greatest fear had come true. He was about to be scooped. He had waited too long, and now another man would get the credit. He wrote to his friends, the geologist Charles Lyell and the botanist Joseph Hooker, in a state of noble despair. They, knowing of Darwin's long, secret labor, arranged a compromise. Wallace's paper and a brief sketch of Darwin's theory were presented together before the Linnean Society in London. The reaction was muted. The scientific world did not yet understand the bomb that had been dropped in its midst. The real explosion would come a year later. Finally, on November 24, 1859, the book was published. Its full title was On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. The first edition of 1,250 copies sold out on the first day. The storm that Darwin had feared for so long broke with a fury that exceeded even his darkest expectations. The book was attacked from pulpits, mocked in newspapers, and defended with passionate intensity by a new generation of scientists, most famously Thomas Henry Huxley, who became known as Darwin's Bulldog. The infamous 1860 Oxford debate between Huxley and Bishop Samuel Wilberforce became a symbolic battleground between science and dogma. Through it all, the quiet, sickly man at Down House remained in his garden, corresponding, revising, letting his bulldog fight his battles, and tending to his orchids. The idea, once released, no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the world. Darwin spent the rest of his life working on the implications of his theory, writing on orchids, on the expression of emotions in humans and animals, and on the humble earthworm, whose quiet, ceaseless labor, he proved, could transform entire landscapes. He died on April 19, 1882, and was buried, against all expectations for a man who had so shaken the church, in Westminster Abbey, a few feet from Sir Isaac Newton. He had shown, with a mountain of evidence and a lifetime of patient work, that the living world, in all its stunning complexity and endless forms most beautiful, was not the product of a single act of creation, but of a long, slow, and magnificent process. He had given us a new way of seeing our own origins, not as a fall from grace, but as a slow, arduous, and deeply humbling rise from the very earth itself. He had not removed the mystery of life. He had deepened it, made it more wondrous, more precious, and infinitely more connected. We are not above nature. We are part of it, a single, beautiful, and unlikely twig on a tree of life that stretches back over 3.5 billion years.